So we are in Vav Amud Aleph, 6a. What we're doing is we're going through a number of different trains of logic that will lead to the same conclusion that a woman who has been declared a Sotah, so her husband warned her, she secluded herself with the man she was warned about. She had not yet drank the waters of the Sotah. In the interim, her husband dies. They have no children, and therefore she has this halachic attachment to her brother-in-law, to her deceased husband's brother. And in this circumstance, we're told she should not marry him, known as yibum. Rather, she should go through the separation known as chalitza. And we've gone through a number of ways of coming to understanding that. We first deduced it from the verse, and then the Gemara used logic that she is a destructive force in the first marriage with the husband. So we can't compel the brother to then also take on this destructive problem, even though she can marry somebody else, because perhaps the two of them will have a happy marriage, but we still can't compel the brother to do that, especially since it was a difficult marriage for his deceased brother. And then the Gemara told us a KAL VACHOMER. The word I was looking for, but Gimple emailed me, is a fortiori. That was the word I was looking for KAL VACHOMER. The judge gave us another Latin word, but a fortiori was the one in my mind. That's the one that Michael Chernak, Olav Shalom, taught me that word. Anyway, so the KAL VACHOMER, the a fortiori, the how much to the more so, the Gemara said yesterday, that's where we left off, is as follows. So we can look at it here. Rava Amar Rava says, KAL VACHOMER, we can make a reasonable deduction of how much to the more so, or a fortiori, or the other Latin word that I can't remember. Okay. In Nesra, if she has become forbidden, b'mutala, to her legitimate husband, to that who she is permitted to, right? Because she is now a Sotah, and the waters that she drinks has not yet determined what happened behind closed doors. So in the meantime, she's forbidden to be intimate with her husband. So if with her actual husband she's forbidden, that's the lenient relationship. The lenient relationship is between her and her husband. And yet we are told they cannot be intimate because she's a Sotah. Then ba'asala, then to that which is the more stringent relationship, namely her brother-in-law, which ordinarily while her husband is alive, she may not be with him. That's one of the forbidden relations. Like Kol Sheken, how much more so that she cannot? So you have the lenient relationship, which is her and her husband, and you have the strict relationship, which is her and her brother-in-law. So if the lenient relationship between her and her brother-in-law, she's forbidden to be with him because she's a Sotah, how much more so with the stricter relationship, her and her brother-in-law, she may not be with him. That's where we left off yesterday. So now, as I said yesterday, the Gemara is now going to take the same line of reasoning, apply it to other cases, and see if it holds up. So Abaye says to his colleague Rava, Elamayata, but now, using that logic, let's apply it to the following case. Kohen Gadol, a high priest, Shekidesh es halmana, that married, Kiddush literally means to sanctify. He went through the marriage ceremony with a widow, halmana, of a widow. So there are different levels of being a Kohen, obviously, two specifically. There's an actual Kohen, and then there is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And the high priest has more restrictions on who he's allowed to marry over and beyond the actual Kohen. So a Kohen, for example, cannot marry a divorcee, but a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, cannot even marry a widow, even though a regular Kohen may marry a widow. So now, the scenario here is a high priest who marries a widow. So he wasn't supposed to marry her. And they also can't live with each other. They can't be intimate. But the marriage, nonetheless, still takes effect, and they require divorce. They require divorce, right? This is an interesting phenomenon. which is there are certain relationships in which even if you did the marriage ceremony, it wouldn't have any validity, and you don't really need a divorce. The language is in kiddushin toifsin. The kiddushin, the ceremony doesn't have any validity, and doesn't even require a divorce. But when it comes to a kohen marrying that which a woman he's not supposed to, the marriage takes effect, even though the relationship is forbidden. So the kohen is legally married to this woman that he's not allowed to live with. The high priest is legally married to an almana, to a widow, and he's not allowed to live with her, even though he's technically married. But now, mace. Now the high priest dies, and they have no children. V'yesh lo ach, and he has a brother who obviously, like him, is a kohen, but his brother is not the high priest. His brother is a kohen hedjit. His brother is an ordinary kohen. So he is permitted to live with a widowed woman. So can he do the yibum? Can he marry his deceased brother's wife, his deceased high priest brother's wife, who was a widow? But according to the logic mentioned before, lo tisyabim, he should not be allowed to marry her. Why? Let's go through the logic. There's two levels of relationship. There's the relationship with her husband, and there's a relationship with her brother-in-law. So the more lenient of the two is her husband, the Kohen Gadol, because this is her actual husband. And yet we're told they cannot live together. So how much more so for the more strict relationship, the brother-in-law, that she can't live with. And that's what the Gemara says. If she's forbidden to live with her husband, which is quote unquote permitted to her, it's her husband, but she's not allowed to be with him because she is a widow, then ba'asala, then to the more strict relationship, which she to begin with is not allowed to be with, namely the brother-in-law, like kol shekain, how much more so she cannot marry him.
But her husband and the brother-in-law are not at the same level. They're different people. I mean, they're more than just related.
Say it again.
Her husband, her first husband,
the Kohen Gadol,
the Kohen Gadol, and his brother are not at the same level. They're not at the same level. Like everything else we've been talking about, the two brothers are at the same level. Here we're talking about really two different levels of people. They're not really the same.
Yeah. So the Gemara is actually going to get there.
Okay.
The Gemara is going to get there. So you're on the right track. But at this point, you're right. At this point, the Gemara just kind of isolates the level of forbiddenness between her and her husband, and the level, and between her and her brother-in-law, and between her and her brother-in-law is a more strict forbiddenness, if that's a word. And therefore, if she cannot be with her own husband, certainly she cannot be with her brother-in-law, following the logic that we used earlier. That's what the Gemara does right now. But before the Gemara gets to your challenge, the Gemara raises a different challenge, which is Nesra. You're saying she now became forbidden to her husband? There was never a point when she was permitted to her husband. Ha'asida v'kaima. She's always been forbidden to her husband from the moment she married him. So this is the first way in which this is different than the law of the Sotah. When it came to the law of the Sotah, for the entirety of the duration of their marriage, they were allowed to be intimate. But now that she secluded herself with this guy and she became a Sotah, now she became forbidden to her husband. So that's when it's appropriate to say that she's forbidden to that which she's permitted to, meaning she's permitted to be with her husband, but now she's forbidden. When it comes to the Kohen Gadol, she was never allowed to be with him. So it's not as if she became forbidden to him. Ha'asida v'kaima, she was always forbidden to him. Moreover, mutila, you're saying to that which is you cannot use the language that she's permitted to be. Like she's become forbidden to be from that which she was permitted to. She was always forbidden, and she was never permitted. Yeah. But you're saying she's permitted. Also, he's forbidden to her. So there was never a relationship between the two.
There's no lenient position here, I guess.
Exactly. That's exactly what the Gemara is saying. There is, and this is kind of, I guess it's incorporating also Robert Burke's point, in that there was no relationship to begin with legally. So it's not as if like there's a lenient one and we're giving a strictness. The marriage is there, but there's no intimacy. There's no connection. Legally, at least. So now we have to reframe Abaye's challenge. What was he challenged Rava and raised this, trying to apply this a fortiori to the case of the Kohen Gadol and a brother. So how do we reconfigure the story to make it somehow work that it's an actual legit challenge? So it says to go more like this. Ella rather, Ashes Kohen, the husband of an ordinary Kohen. Shenensa, and she was unfortunately raped. So the halacha is as follows. When a woman behaves promiscuously during their marriage, for a normal Jew, she willingly engages with another man, then they divorce. But if, God forbid, she was raped, she didn't willfully engage in that act, then he stays married to her. That's the law of an ordinary Jew. When it comes to a Kohen, however, if, God forbid, his wife was raped, he's not allowed to live with her. This is one of the levels of the Kohen, the restrictions on being a Kohen, of who he's allowed to be intimate with. And he cannot be intimate with somebody who had a forbidden relation, even though it was against her will. So now let's go through this. Ashes Kohen, the wife of a Kohen, Shenensa, who's unfortunately been raped. Now Mace. Now the husband dies. So he is not allowed to be with her. At the moment of his death, he wasn't allowed to be with her intimately. But she was permitted to be with her before. He was permitted to be with her before the moment of that she was raped. So at one point, he was permitted, and now he's no longer permitted. This is like the Sotah. He was permitted to be with his wife, and then once she became a Sotah, he's not allowed to be with his wife. Same here. The Kohen was allowed to be with her when they first got married. She was an ordinary, nice Jewish girl. And now that she's raped, unfortunately, he can't be with her. So at the moment of his death, he wasn't allowed to live with her. Now, Yesh Loi Ach, he has a brother, but this brother isn't a Kohen. This brother is a Chalal. A Chalal is a Kohen who lost his status as a Kohen. So how is it possible for his brother to lose his status as a Kohen, whereas he didn't lose his status as a Kohen? So explains Rashi that they share a father, but they have a different mother. So there's, right, their father's a Kohen, right? They're Kohenim, so their father's a Kohen. But their father had one legitimate marriage, and that gave birth to this first guy, the husband, and therefore he's a Kohen. But the father also got married to a divorcee, which he wasn't supposed to marry. And therefore his children from the second woman are not Kohanim. But the two are brothers. So you have a brother, one's a Kohen and one's not a Kohen. So now, following the logic mentioned before, Loi Tisyabim, this brother who's not a Kohen should not marry his deceased brother's wife, the sister-in-law, even though he's not a Kohen. Why? Because Imnes Rabbi Mutila, she became forbidden to that which is permitted to her. She was allowed to be the Mutila to that which is permitted to her. She was allowed to live with her husband. And then she got raped. Unfortunately, now she can't be intimate with her husband. So that's the lenient relationship. The lenient relationship is her first marriage, which she was allowed to be with her husband. And then because of this terrible incident, she no longer could be with her husband. Now her husband's dead. And there's a brother-in-law who's now not a Kohen, which in theory could marry her. But Ba'asala, that's the more strict relationship, because initially she wasn't allowed to be with him because it's a brother-in-law. Like Kosher can, how much more so she can't be with him. And this matches the Sotah. This matches the Sotah perfectly. The Sotah is the same thing. Initially they were allowed to be together. She became a Sotah, now they can't be together, and therefore she can't go to the brother-in-law because that's the more strict relationship. Right? The lenient relationship, her husband became forbidden. So the more strict relationship, the brother-in-law certainly is forbidden. Same thing here. He's a Kohen. He's allowed to live with this nice young Jewish girl, this nice Jewish woman, and an unfortunate incident, and now they become forbidden. So if she's forbidden to their lenient relationship, she's forbidden to her own husband, how much more so she's forbidden to the stricter relationship, the brother-in-law, even though the brother-in-law is not a Kohen anymore. Okay, so I hope this is somewhat clear. So this is the challenge that Abaye is giving Rava, that using your logic, we should apply it to this case as well. Okay, and now the Gemara rejects this challenge using logic that Robert Berkey mentioned. The Gemara says like this: Oynis bi Yisrael mishra sharia. And a woman who went through this unfortunate incident of rape is permitted to live with an ordinary Jew, not with a Kohen, with a regular Jew. And therefore, v'gabe dahai lekei Sotah. To the brother-in-law, there was never a prohibition. Meaning to say like this, the two brothers aren't the same status here. The one brother, from the start, always had this prohibition on him that he's not allowed to live with a woman who had an unfortunate incident of rape. Whereas the other brother was always allowed to be with such a person. So there is no equation, right? They're not starting off on equal footing, of which you can make this a fortiori that one is more strict and one is more lenient. In the incident of the Sotah, the two brothers, have equal law. They're both equally allowed to marry women, and they're both equally not allowed to live with Sotah women. And then the Sotah of one brother transfers to the Sotah of the next brother when he dies. But in this case, they're not on equal footing. One brother is allowed to marry a woman who had an unfortunate incident, and one brother can't. And therefore, the fact that the brother who was a Kohen became forbidden to his wife because she was raped does not transfer to the brother who never had such a prohibition on him. Because they never started on equal footing, even though it happens to be that she's now forbidden to the more lenient relationship. She's forbidden to be with her husband. But that prohibition, that restriction can't transfer to the brother who was never part of that prohibition to begin with. Because he was always, in theory, allowed to marry a woman who had an unfortunate incident of rape. Whereas the case of the Sotah, where they are equally prohibited to live with a Sotah because they always share that same prohibition, then we could say a transfer from one brother to the next. Okay, I hope that was somewhat clear. If it's not, please unmute yourself and ask for clarity. And otherwise, we'll go forward to the next Mishnah and we'll conclude after we learn the Mishnah. Okay, so I hope that was clear. Okay, so this all concludes the discussion on this law that the prohibition that the husband has with his wife after she's a Sotah, before she drinks the water, rolls over to the brother-in-law, and therefore they cannot marry, they have to do chalitza. Now the Mishnah tells us another set of laws related to the last law mentioned in the previous Mishnah. The last law mentioned in the previous Mishnah, or one of the last laws at least, is the fact that a Sotah woman cannot eat truma. So I mentioned this before, that the law is that the tithe that goes to the Kohen, the produce that must be given to the Kohen as part of the Jews' tax to maintain and to support the Kohanim in the temple era, is what's called teruma. Now the law, this truma gets a certain status of holiness and must be eaten with certain purity. The Kohen cannot be impure when he eats it, and it has a certain elevated status of holiness. It's not in the same level of holiness as, say, when a Kohen eats a korban or eats an offering in the temple, but it still gets some level of holiness. And additionally, once it's given to the Kohen, then anybody in the Kohen's household can eat it, him and his children and his wife. Now, when this woman becomes a Sotah, and now they can't be intimate with each other, so she's somewhat, even though the marriage isn't over, right? Because if she drinks the water and she turns out to be okay, then they keep on living together. But in the interim, their marriage is like in suspension, and she can't be intimate with him. And likewise, she cannot eat the truma if he was a Kohen. She doesn't have the status of being an ordinary member of her household, which would ordinarily be allowed to eat the truma. So the Mishnah now lists a number of scenarios within the law of the Sotah that would make a woman in such a stance where she's not allowed to eat the truma. As follows: Ve'elu asuris melechel b'truma. And the following are women who would lose their ability to eat the truma if they were married to a Kohen. Scenario 1: Ha'emeres, if she comes forth and says, Timeya nilach, I have been defiled, I've cheated on you, or even if, God forbid, she was an unfortunate incident of rape, but she admits to having a forbidden relationship with somebody else. So she admits to infidelity, she no longer is allowed to eat the truma. Likewise, that's scenario 1. Number 2, Ushabo Edim, if witnesses came and said, Shehitmeya, that she was unfaithful. So whether she admits she was unfaithful, or if witnesses come and say she was unfaithful, in both those instances, she can no longer eat truma. That's case number 2. The Gemara is going to spend a bit of time discussing exactly when these witnesses arrive to testify that she was unfaithful. Did they say so before she drank the water, or after she drank the water? We're going to get into that. But that's scenario number 2. Scenario number 1 is where she admits to infidelity, and scenario 2 is where witnesses come and say she was unfaithful. Scenario 3, a woman who says, I'm not interested in drinking water. So she's been warned. She's been declared a Sotah because she secluded herself with this guy, but she doesn't want to drink the water. She doesn't want to go through the process. So at this point, I mentioned this yesterday, they divorce. She loses her rights to the ketubah, to the money of the ketubah, but because she forgoes the drinking of the water. That's scenario number 3. Scenario number 4 is if the husband decides he doesn't want to give her the waters. I also mentioned this yesterday, that if the husband decides he doesn't want her to drink the water, also there, he can choose to divorce her instead of going through the whole process of drinking the water and making her find out what happened behind closed doors. So that is scenario number 4, right? Number 1 is she admits to infidelity. Number 2 is witnesses come to say she was unfaithful. Number 3 is she decides she doesn't want to go through the process of drinking the water. And number 4 is he decides he doesn't want to go through the process of making her drink the water. And number 5 is if the husband was intimate with her before she drank the water, which means like this. He warned her. She secluded herself with the guy that she was warned about. She became a Sotah, and he's technically forbidden to live with her. But on the way, he decides that he wants to be intimate with her in between the warning, or between the seclusion and the drinking of the water. He is illegally intimate with her. In that act, she loses her ability to eat the truma, because essentially they've undone the Sotah law, rendering their marriage invalid, because he was intimate with her when he wasn't supposed to. So she's not allowed to eat truma anymore. So these are the scenarios mentioned in the Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to go through each of them to explain exactly what's going on and why it is so. So we'll stop over here, and God willing, tomorrow we're going to look at, the Gemara is actually going to begin with the second scenario, where witnesses come and say she was intimate, and the Gemara is going to discuss exactly when these witnesses arrive to tell us she was intimate. Do they arrive after she drinks the water, before she drinks the water? And that's going to be an interesting discussion as well coming tomorrow.
What if she was raped?
So as I mentioned before, in an unfortunate case of rape, the husband cannot be with his wife because he's a Kohen.
Could she eat the truma?
So she can't eat the truma there. I don't think so, because they have to separate. It's one of these unfortunate cases where for no fault of her own,
Right.
she loses leaves out on that whole thing.
Have a great day, everybody.
Have a wonderful day, buddy.
You too. Great day. Thank you.
All right. See you tomorrow.
We'll see you tomorrow, God willing.